All right, in this segment, I want to address a question that came up that somebody posed. They posed the idea that Jesus was a fictional character, and they said that um, the problem with the New Testament documents is that they were written 30 years, or they said several decades after the events of Jesus. So I want to address that first of all by saying that categorically it's just not true. Um, that the earliest, the soonest somebody started writing was the Apostle Paul, and he wrote probably the book of Galatians or the book of Thessalonians 18 years after the resurrection of Christ. He was addressing churches that he that knew were struggling with different issues, and he wrote letters to them. Not 18 years after uh, Christ had rose from the dead, and so that right there is just a fact that people should be aware of when they're thinking about the validity and the historicity of Jesus and the church and the Bible. But I want to take the assumption that he was right, that maybe they were 30 years. That still doesn't put any doubt on the idea of Jesus being a fictional character just because, the documents were written maybe 30, 40, 50 years after Jesus died. That doesn't pose a problem to the historicity of who Jesus is. Uh, let me read this real quick that I wrote. While it might seem like light years to us today, 30, 50 years after the event, in the first century church, that wouldn't be unreasonable for a historic document to be created 30, 40, or 50 years after the death of an influential person. And in our 21st century mind, where we get cell phone updates on final scores of our favorite sports team, like 30 seconds after the game ends, it's impossible for us to fathom how a document describing some influential person in the late 80s, whose no one ever heard of, if it were produced today, for us to be expected to accept that or believe that by the general public, to be accepted by the general public. It just wouldn't happen. It wouldn't look good. We wouldn't accept it, and it would be laughed away. But no one questioned it in the early century because it was general knowledge who this Jesus was that the disciples were talking about. And it's hard for me to imagine, even now though, how a fictional or mythical character could be created 30, 40, 50 years after his death or resurrection in the case of Jesus, because there's too many people that are still alive within 30, 40, or 50 years who would debunk a document that would be created describing this person. And that's why we know today that no document being created today about somebody in the 80s who was influential, if nobody's ever heard of him, we would pose the obvious fact that nobody had ever heard of him. But that's not what happened in Jesus' day. Plenty of people heard about who Jesus was, and nobody doubted the description of the Gospels or the letters of Paul or any of the writers of the New Testament because they all knew who Jesus was. There were no questions. Even the enemies of the church, people who would have wanted to discredit Christianity, never posed any other documents, or there were never any public arguments about, oh, this person was a mythical character, because everybody accepted who this was. And this is the exact argument that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 15, chapter 5, when he speaks of the resurrection. He says there are 500 people still that saw the resurrected Jesus, and some are still alive today, which is what he says. And basically he's saying, go check it out. Ask them. They'll explain to you or tell you what they saw, what they experienced. So that is my answer to people who might question the validity of the documents, number one, and number two, even doubt whether Jesus really did live.